On the 6th of July 1988, the Piper Alpha oil rig in the North Sea exploded, killing 167 people, and 61 people survived. The circumstances that led to the tragedy of Piper Alpha and the 167 deaths reveal a corner-cutting, profit-hungry management. I mean, this was entirely avoidable. The warnings were there, but the conditions surrounding the disaster itself are quite shocking. So the water deluge system, the main defence against fire, the sprinkler system, failed. And even the public inquiry concluded that even if it had been working, it was so rusted up with scale and rust that it probably wouldn't have worked anyway. Emergency lighting failed. The crew didn't even have enough torches issued to them to deal with an emergency. The lifeboats were located in the same place, which happened to be one of the more dangerous parts of the installation. When people followed the official instructions, they gathered at the muster point, which was the accommodation module located directly above one of the gas compression modules, which turned out to be one of the least safe places on the platform. And then, because of the construction of the accommodation module, it was made out of wood and fiberglass, it very quickly began to burn. So they found out that by following official instructions, they were in the least safe place they could be, and in fact, most people who survived disobeyed official instructions. Occidental's senior manager had been warned about this by their own consultants. They had been warned that the platform had been modified to the point that it was in an overproduction mode. It was producing far too much that the infrastructure could carry, and it had been also warned that it would not withstand prolonged exposure to sustained high-intensity fire. They chose to ignore those warnings, but they also chose to ignore the warnings of workers. A month before the disaster, there were several warnings of gas leaks. There had been, I think, in the 3 years running up to the disaster, something like 75 gas leaks that had been ignored. Occidental, as an employer, and the contractors that were employed by them, applied a kind of informal policy of sacking people who complained about safety, because there was very low trade union coverage, mostly subcontracted, typically about 90% of employees on oil rigs at the time. It's not far off it now, but were subcontracted. And so it was very easy to control the workforce, and it was very typical for people who complained about safety to be removed. They had a system called the NRB, and what would happen is that someone's work cards would be stamped NRB, not required back, typically if they were seen as being a troublemaker. Some of this stuff does still go on, as we know, across industries which are characterised by subcontracting. In the building industry, we know there's still problems. The problem of blacklisting has not been entirely eradicated, and that's the same for the offshore industries. The warnings were there, and they were there from those who suffered the most, the workforce, the workers. And I think there are very big similarities with what happened with the Grenfell Action Group. The warnings were there. Sometimes you can see that the warnings were very, very similar indeed. And what was the response? Well, the response of the local authority was not just to exclude those voices, but was to criticise them and indeed go on the attack against some of those critical voices in precisely the same way the oil companies did. The industry was left to regulate itself. The normal rules that applied to onshore working didn't apply offshore. So the Health and Safety at Work Act didn't apply offshore at the time, and many of the legal safety standards didn't apply. And that was very, very simply because the government wanted to encourage what the academic Kit Carson called the political economy of speed. They needed the oil out of the ground as quickly as possible because they wanted the receipts initially to bail out Britain's balance of payments crisis, and latterly Thatcher used them to fund mass unemployment effectively. So there was a political economy which allowed the companies to kind of regulate themselves and do what they wanted as long as the oil flowed quickly and as long as some of that tax money flowed into the British Exchequer. So workers paid the price of a system which allowed companies to pretty much self-regulate. We can see that all over Grenfell Tower. This is exactly what's happened in building regulation. We see that building companies themselves are doing the desktop testing. They're being monitored by a regulatory authority which includes representatives from the companies themselves. Or if we look at the tenant management organisation, the TMO, it's now responsible for fire certification, whereas in the past it would be the fire authority that was responsible for fire certification. So the bodies who are responsible for establishing those compliance standards are effectively self-regulating. One of the responses to Piper Alpha very, very quickly in the 2 years that followed was workers got organised. And workers got organised to demand self-organisation around and representation around safety, right? The immediate response from the workforce was that we want control over some of the conditions that affect us the most in terms of the safety of our jobs. They weren't entirely successful in doing that, and the workforce is still fairly fragmented. But similar demands have been coming from campaigners in relation to Grenfell. We need more control over the conditions of our housing. We need to have social housing that's democratically accountable, and not just accountable to remote bodies that are made up of appointees, but democratically accountable and run by tenants themselves. And I think that's one of the big lessons here, is that we need to empower people to have control over the things that affect them most in their lives if we're going to avoid tragedies like this. We can't continue with a system where remote elites are in control of our lives, because they have shown that they are not going to look after us or our interests very well. Around the country, there are isolated examples of communities, of tenants, organisations that run on a relatively small scale their own housing, right? So there's, it's not that we don't have to look very far to see those examples. It's much more difficult to conceptualise how you would have workers control over oil rigs or over oil production. And there's of course a much bigger question about whether we want oil production at all, right, in the context of global warming. But one thing's for sure, if you did have workers control over hazardous industries like oil, chemicals, and so on, you wouldn't have a political economy of speed which ensures that maximum production is the clarion call or the principle that the plant has to run by, right? You could have a much more responsible approach to managing these things, but we're talking about big vested interests. We're talking about very big companies, and so I think to contemplate workers' control of the big industries, we need to contemplate a bigger process of social transformation. There are places where it's happening. I mean, if you look to Catalonia, there is a movement to bring a lot of energy supply industries under local control, right? I don't think we're that far away from that here. There is a debate about what we do with our energy industry here and why so many people should be dying in the winter because they can't afford to pay their energy bills when there seems to be a kind of perennial windfall profits for those companies. So I think we can look to places that have tried to nationalise, but not only nationalise, even localise and bring under local control those industries, but more importantly, democratise. We're facing nationalisations in this country. The East Coast Line has just been brought back into public control, but it's not been democratised. passengers and the workers on that line won't have a say about how that's run. So that's where we need to go. We need to think about how we democratise, not rather than simply nationalise those industries that are exploiting us.